Hello, and welcome to today's Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center of Livable Communities webinar. Today's webinar is titled, Accessing Funding for Bicycle and Pedestrian Projects under MAP-21, and we will be speaking with Darren Flouchet, Policy Director with the League of American Bicyclists, and Peter Lagerwey, Regional Office Director for Tool Design Group. My name is James Gallagher, and I am the PBIC Communications Manager. I will be facilitating today's webinar. I'd first like to say hello to today's speakers to make sure they're ready and that everyone can hear them. Darren, are you there?
I'm here.
And Pete, do we have you on the line as well?
I'm here.
Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear our speakers, please click the hand icon located in the box in the upper right corner of your screen so that to raise your hand. This lets us know that you can hear us. Great, I'm seeing lots of hands. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You will be able to rejoin the session. Please note that please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, and by muting your audio, it helps us to cut down confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. Though you are not able to speak, you do have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I will monitor these questions and respond to you if I am able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but they will not be addressed until the end of the program when we have built in about 20 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along, and we'll try to get to them after the presentation. When you exit the webinar, there's a brief survey that will pop up. We would appreciate your feedback on our performance. Within the week following today's webinar, you will receive a follow-up email from the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. Please do not delete this email. That email will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward that link to the other participants so that they can download and print their certificates as well. This webinar has been submitted to AICP and has been approved for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit www.rsa.unc.edu. For more information on future webinars or to view the archives from this webinar series and others, please visit www.walkinginfo.org/webinars. You may also stay abreast of PBIC webinars by following us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/pedbike. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at www.walkinginfo.org/training. Now I'd like to welcome and thank Darren and Pete for their presentations today. We'll take questions at the end. Darren, take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you very much, James. My name is Darren Flouchet, Policy Director for the League of American Bicyclists. You'll notice that these slides say Advocacy Advance. That's because Advocacy Advance is a partnership between the League and the Alliance for Biking and Walking. And we're doing a lot of work to help not only state and local advocates, but also regional and state agency staff and elected officials understand MAP-21 and put it into effect, especially in ways that support bicycling and walking and active transportation. So what I'm going to talk about today is what are the rules of the various funding programs under MAP-21, the federal laws, and then understand that states and regions set up their own systems and policies and can add layers of rules onto that. So it's important to understand these are the federal rules and your state and region will vary. I'm going to talk about how agencies are setting up the process and some of the things that work well for bicycling and walking, some things that don't. We encourage advocates to participate and give input into this process. MAP-21 is still being implemented, still in the early stages, so there's a lot of opportunities for input there. And then as applicants, many of you will be interested to understand what makes a good application and what's eligible and who is eligible to apply. So we're going to cover all those things today. I just want to start really quick with a background on federal funding. So this is a chart that shows that we've seen pretty good growth in federal investments over the last 20 years, and the question is, what comes next now that we're in MAP-21? That orange line there is the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, the stimulus bill. And the other piece here is these are federal funds, but the decisions are state and regional. So they're funds that come from the gas tax, but the decisions are state and regional. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This slide just shows that there's a full range of funding programs that has funded bicycling and walking over that same period of time since 1992. The big blue pie on the right is transportation enhancements. We're going to talk about what has become of that program and two others. But the point of this slide is lots of programs have been funding bicycling and walking for a long time, and we need to really think about the full range of opportunities in MAP-21. You see that as the funding went up, it was tracked by a growth in bicycle commuting. So we learned that communities that have made strategic investments in bicycling and walking have seen growth in the number of people using those modes for transportation in their daily lives. There's been growth nationally across the board, but significantly more growth in bicycle-friendly communities, places that have made these smart investments. So what's MAP-21? First of all, it's moving ahead for progress in the 21st century. This is one in a series of federal authorization bills. Basically tells the state how they can spend their funds. It's a 2-year bill. That was the longest that Congress was able to come up with a consensus and find funding for. It went into effect October 1st of last year and will go through September 30th of 2014. Keep in mind that the other recent bills have taken a long time to authorize, and so we may be living with MAP-21 for longer than that period. In general, it keeps the funding levels stable with a little bit of increase for inflation. So what was Congress trying to do with this bill? Well, one of the things was to consolidate programs. They felt that there was a maze of federal programs and they wanted to slim down and streamline those programs. They wanted to allow states to have more flexibility in how they spent their money, and they wanted to make it easier for communities to access these funds by streamlining project delivery and reducing some of the red tape involved. If you only take one thing away from this presentation, I hope that it's this. Bicycling and walking projects are fully eligible for a full range of programs under MAP-21. That might not seem like a big deal. You might take that for granted. But it's not just the Transportation Alternatives Program that we're going to talk about. It's a full range of programs where bicycling and walking are fully eligible, and they can access these funds, but that requires applications, and it requires a process that makes that achievable. So we're going to talk about these programs today. First, the Transportation Alternatives Program. This is one that the components of it are going to be familiar to all of us. It combined 3 of the major bicycling and walking funding programs: transportation enhancements, safe routes to school, and recreational trails. So most of the activities that you could do under TE, now called Transportation Alternatives Activities, you can still do. We'll talk about some of the exceptions on the next slide. Safe routes to school programs and recreational trails programs, all those activities are still eligible. There's a 4th category of activity called the redevelopment of underused highways to boulevards. So you can convert certain unused highway corridors to complete streets and boulevards. So overall, the amount dedicated to transportation alternatives was reduced. So if you took all those 3 funding pots in fiscal year 2011, it came to $1.2 billion. In fiscal year 2013, the Transportation Alternatives Program is receiving $808 million. So we're seeing approximately a 30% reduction in the total amount. But we still have this program, and it was from the federal advocacy perspective, it was a success to be able to maintain a program that has a large focus on bicycling and walking. So you can still do those bicycling and walking infrastructure facilities. You can also do something called safe routes for non-drivers. This is a term that's not really defined in the bill, and so it's a real opportunity for people to kind of get creative and work with their states to figure out what does that mean. And in particular, it means investments that are going to help older Americans, younger Americans, people with disabilities, people that choose not to drive, access the things for their daily lives that are important. Create networks for non-drivers. MAP-21 also increased some of the activities you can do in terms of environmental mitigation and the scenic byways and turnouts activity. So those are some non-bicycling and walking activities. It also removed the opportunity to use transportation alternatives funds for bicycling and walking education. So people that trained league-certified instructors and taught adult education using TE funds in the past will no longer be able to use TA funds for that activity. However, safe routes to school, K through 8 education is still eligible. It also took out some streetscaping activities, certain scenic highway, scenic historic site activities like acquisition, and transportation museums, which were hot-button political issues during the reauthorization debate. So this is a little infographic to show how the transportation alternatives funds flow down to your community. It starts up in the upper left with MAP-21. The Transportation Alternatives Program is a small piece of that. The funds get distributed to each state Department of Transportation. Now, the first thing each DOT had to do prior to October 1st was decide whether or not it was going to keep the recreational trails program intact and take those funds off the top to maintain that program pretty much the way they had always done it. And 48 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia maintain the recreational trails program, Kansas and Florida being the exceptions to that. Those two states will put those funds back into transportation alternatives and have a slightly larger pot there. The others will maintain the Rec Trails program. So then the state has to divide its transportation alternatives funds into two pots. One is based on population in the state. So depending on the share of the residents in your state that live in communities under 5,000, between 5,000 and 200,000, and over 200,000, the funds get distributed to those communities. Now, the important piece here is for metropolitan regions with populations over 200,000, they are required to run their own competitive process that local entities can apply directly to the MPO, and the MPO has the authority to decide which projects to fund. They will work with their DOTs, and the DOTs will help administer the projects, but that decision-making happens at the local level. The other half gets distributed across the state. Now, most DOTs will combine the smaller community piece and the Pot 2 into one program. So these local entities can also apply to the state process. So who are these local entities? Well, local governments, regional transportation and transit authorities, school districts for the Safe Routes to School program, public land agencies, and tribal governments can all apply directly to their MPO if they're in a region over 200,000 population, or the state otherwise. State DOTs, because they run the competitive process, are not eligible to compete for the funds. That also goes for metropolitan planning organizations. So a lot of people, a lot of MPO staff and others are asking, okay, so for the first time we're required to do a competitive process. Maybe this is something we've done for the STP program, but it's not something that we've done for TE in the past. So what does this look like? So I just put up a couple of examples that I think are really good. The Northwest Indiana Regional Commission has for a long time run their Transportation Enhancements Program as a competitive process. So they already had a model that they were able to borrow from. Their criteria includes population density, whether or not your project connects to the regional network of trails, whether or not an environmental justice population is served, so an underserved community, are they going to be able to access this facility? Constructability, what are some of the barriers? Is there a lot of right-of-way acquisition that are going to be needed, or is it something that can really be done right away? And is your facility connecting to employment centers? And the other thing that they did right off the top is they said that they were going to divide their funds 80% to bicycling and walking projects, 10% to safe routes to school, and 10% to historic preservation and environment. So they made that executive decision that that's how they were going to distribute their funds. On the other side there, I have the National Capital Region. That's here in Washington, D.C. And their criteria were, does it provide transportation choices for people? Does it provide safety improvements? And does it provide accessibility for people with disabilities? They also ask simply if it's a safe route to school type project, and whether or not it connects to transit, employment centers, and whether or not it's part of a planned system. So was that project in your bicycle master plan or your transportation master plan? Those are all the criteria that they use, and we think those are really good examples, and obviously there's lots of different ways to do this. You can also follow the lead of Transportation for America, for example, and focus on livability, so connectivity to libraries, grocery stores, restaurants, and things like that, accessibility and equity, economic development, the environment, health, and safety. So there's lots of criteria you can use, but we think these are good ones that really focus on some of the strengths of bicycling and walking. So another, something to be cautious of is that states have increased flexibility to transfer funds out of TA. It used to be protected from TE. Now states can transfer the entirety of that pot 2, that state distributed portion. So we're keeping an eye on the states and encouraging them to spend transportation alternatives dollars on transportation alternatives projects. Also, if a state chooses not to spend any of its money or is slow in setting up these programs, they can flex the unspent funds, the overflowing funds, into the congestion mitigation air quality improvement program. So lots of reasons to make sure that we're setting up these programs efficiently and getting projects on the ground. On the other hand, states can also transfer funds into the Transportation Alternatives Program. So it's not necessary, it's not just a threat, it's also an opportunity, and some states are talking about doing that. So we talked about local control. States can apply, can't compete for the funds. Safe routes to school coordinators at the state level are eligible, despite the fact that state DOTs in general are not. And although nonprofit groups were not among those lists of eligible entities to apply for transportation alternatives funds, they can work with an eligible applicant and utilize the funds and help with the project. The bad news is the Safe Routes to School program used to have a 100% federal match. Now it now joins the other activity types with an 80-20 match. And again, the adult education is not eligible. So TA is obviously a really good and valuable funding source, and it's one that I hope everyone on the call will take advantage of. However, it's really in the other funding sources that we're going to be able to make a large difference in the investments that we make in bicycling and walking. So I want to walk through some of those programs quickly. The Service Transportation Program it's everybody's favorite program. It's incredibly flexible, it's a large funding source, and you can do almost anything with it. The federal government covers typically 80%. There's some exceptions to that. Localities are expected to match the remaining 20%. You can do both construction and non-construction, so people have in the past funded things like bicycle maps and trainings and things like that, in addition to sidewalks, crosswalks, trails, and on-road facilities for bikes. So what happened under MAP-21? Well, there is more money for SDP, but there's also a lot more competition. For example, some bridges that were formerly covered under our Highway Bridge program are now under STP. So it's not a panacea, but there's a lot of opportunity to compete for these funds. And sometimes we'll talk to people running these programs and say, well, you know, no one's ever submitted a bicycling and walking project, so we don't fund them. So knowing about all these programs is really important. Anything you can do under the Transportation Alternatives Program, you can do under STP. So, quick example of what makes a good policy. You know the expression, if it plays in Peoria, it'll play anywhere. Well, this is Peoria stepping up to the bicycling game. Before 2006, they had kind of a loose criteria, and it was just sort of agency folks debating the merits of the projects. The FHWA district office had asked them to put together a quantified application, and they said, while you're at it, you might want to consider including bicycling and walking, give some points for those activities. So the Metropolitan Planning Organization was receptive to that, and they turned to the League, the League of Illinois Bicyclists for suggestions. So Ed Barsati, the ED there, turned to his board, and they said, you know what? Here's some ideas. You can put 2 points for sidewalks, 2 points for bike lanes, points for lighting and pedestrian crosswalks, and so forth. The MPO took that recommendation, and they really ran with it, and they implemented that new application. So previously they had not built many sidewalks, trails, or lanes in their STP projects. Overnight that changed, and it changed because in order to get full points you had to include active transportation facilities, and these funds are competitive, and so all of a sudden all the projects, vast majority of the projects included those facilities as appropriate. So a really small change like that can have a radical impact on the investments that your community makes. The next program I want to talk about is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program. And I'll just note that there's a lot more to be said about each of these programs. So if you go to advocacyadvance.org/resources and /MAP-21 separately, obviously, you can find a lot more resources. So CMAQ. CMAQ is for communities that do not meet federal air quality standards, and it can be used both for construction projects and non-construction projects. So you see the picture there, the bike share infrastructure, the stations themselves were paid for by congestion mitigation and air quality improvement funds. Typically there's a 80% federal share, and the community is expected to pitch in 20%. If a state does not have any areas that don't meet air quality standards, then they can more or less use these funds as STP funds, Service Transportation Program funds. So what are the changes for CMAQ in MAP-21? Well, they talk about eligibility of a project or program that shifts traffic demands to other modes. So we think that this kind of adds some flexibility, maybe even some opportunities for education in CMAQ. You have to work with your state to figure out exactly that. There is more flexibility to transfer out of CMAQ. But really importantly, they're understanding that the future of transportation investments is really going to involve measuring our impact. So they're requiring a cost-benefit analysis and an assessment of health impacts as part of the CMAQ implementation process now. So I think that tells us where we're going in the future of these transportation authorization bills. So I won't go through this list one by one, but just point out that there's a whole range of bicycling and walking type activities that CMAQ can fund, everything from large long-term bike parking in Chicago and smaller, several thousand bike racks in Sacramento, to bike education, promotion, and things like that. So the question becomes, if there's all these opportunities in Service Transportation Program and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, how can I make sure that my process is set up in a way that doesn't exclude bicycling and walking, and in fact makes a level playing field? And so here's some examples. In California, Illinois, they the regions make the decisions, and they have sort of more authority over their transportation choice, and we find that that can tend to be really favorable, and that led to a lot of the advocacy we did around transportation alternatives and that metropolitan area grant program or competitive process. Chicago and Kansas City say, okay, we're going to compare our diesel retrofit projects with our diesel retrofit projects and our bike projects with our bike projects, or bike walk and bike walk. So an apples to apples type piece, and then you can make sure that the best programs of each type get funded. And you can, if you say, well, how do you know how to divide up the funds? You can do that based on how many applications for each project type you get. Seattle just has a straight 10% set aside for both these programs for non-motorized, which is obviously great. That should be a floor, not a ceiling. And then Milwaukee doesn't do any of these things, but they make sure that bicycling is integrated and walking are integrated into all of their planning, so that every time you're trying to make a project selection decision, you can go back to a plan, and sure enough, you can find a bicycling and walking project that's been sort of thoughtful, connects to the network, etc. And they also spend a lot of time working with advocates and local applicants to make sure that they're getting good applications. And so those are some really easy things that communities can do in terms of good planning to facilitate these investments. So next I want to talk about two safety programs. The first is for infrastructure. It's the Highway Safety Improvement Program. Obviously there's highway in the name, but all public roads are eligible. You can do things like build bike lanes, expand shoulders, do crosswalks and signage. The key here is it's incredibly data driven. They're really, FHWA has been really focused on this. They need to be able to show that the project is going to noticeably reduce fatalities. And so we need to be able to show that with data. So that's an important thing for applicants to know. Typically because they want to encourage safety investments, it's a 90% federal share. So HSIP, or Highway Safety Improvement Program, is a really critical one for a lot of us because it was one of the programs that really grew. It almost doubled in size. And so we think this is an opportunity to access funds for bicycling and walking without taking away funds from other project types. Bike ped in school zones is still eligible. And what's important for, I think, many people on the call is MAP-21 calls for the participation of non-motorized representatives and safety stakeholders in writing the safety plans. And the safety plans, as I mentioned, really guide the spending here. And so it's a direct call for participation from state non-motorized representatives, of which I think there are many on this webinar. So ask your state about that. What's their timing for revising their plans, and how can you participate? It's been a data-driven program for a long time, but they're increasing the focus on that. So we're working closely with FHWA to see what we can do in terms of measuring non-motorized crashes, and obviously fatalities continue that. The other piece is we think it's loosened up the criteria a little bit. So if you can identify a roadway element or feature that either constitutes a hazard or can lead to the safety improvement of a corridor or a community, then you can do that based on its type rather than just identifying intersections of risk. And that can be good for bicycling and walking fatalities, which can be more diffuse, especially bicycling. So, real quick example of what's a good policy. Virginia, at the urging of a state legislator, actually, so your elected officials are really important in this, decided to match the amount of funds that went to bicycle and pedestrian safety with the number of fatalities that unfortunately involve people on foot and people on bike. And so that's a really good policy because so many states right now aren't investing in bicycling and walking safety. Virginia went ahead and said, okay, we're going to make sure that we're doing proportional investments to the risk and the danger and the fatalities out there. It's for advocates to make sure that internal policy is being delivered on. So the last program I want to talk about is for non-infrastructure. It's called Section 402 State and Community Highway Safety Grant Program. We call it Section 402 for short because that's a mouthful, and that's the the part of the law in which it's written into. So this is jointly administered by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Federal Highway Administration. It is, as I mentioned, exclusively for non-infrastructure, and so really that lends itself well to education programs. So a lot of advocacy groups actually can directly receive these funds to run in-school education and other things like that, including like PSAs. The one thing to note, if you're interested in receiving a direct grant, is its reimbursement. So your city or your advocacy group needs to have the funds in advance and then do the program and then get reimbursed. So the good news is bicycle and pedestrian safety for adults are still fully eligible in 402. And so we think, you know, some attention will be shifted away from the TA program to Section 402. A few examples, and the one that I love here is Bike Texas. They have a license plate program in the state where if you pay the extra fee to have a God Bless Texas or Share the Road license plate, Bike Texas actually receives the additional funds to do bicycle education, and so that gives them the upfront money to do 402 and get reimbursed that way. Lots of different activities have been done, from helmet distribution to Share the Road education to trainings to Bike Safety Month. Bike Walk Connecticut in the Hartford region, the Hartford MPO received a grant to do some education, and then when they were done with it, they turned over the materials that they had bought, the advertising and some computers and so forth, to Bike Walk Connecticut. So that's just a great example of working with advocacy organizations and agency staffs that are collaborating. So where does all this leave us? What's the big picture here? What can we do to access these funds, since that is the title of the program today? Well, the first thing is I have to mention planning. It starts with the long-range plan, setting up the vision, and sometimes identifying specific projects depending on the region and the state. And then each community and state have to develop their own plans. And to receive federal funds, you really need to be able to point to the plan that has identified the need there. So it's really important that everyone on this call participate all the way through this process to make sure the vision's there, the individual plan is there, and then through the selection process that we talked about just now, those projects get added to the Transportation Improvement Program. That's the document that says, okay, here's what we're going to do over the next 4 years, and then see it through to implementation. So this is a long haul. This is a long process, but there's opportunities for all of us to sort of participate in there. So I want to talk about some of the policies that, as agencies that are running these programs, need to think about, and that's what are your policies and what are your guidance. So what are the rules that you establish, and how do they treat pedestrian projects, bicycle projects? Do they treat them fairly? Do they encourage all road projects to include those elements in them? Does your application ask about biking and walking? If it doesn't, you might not hear about it. You might not get those applications. A really simple thing to do. What are the criteria? We talked about some of the transportation alternatives criteria that people are using. How do you prioritize one project over another? Are you taking into account, after you've asked about them in your application, hopefully, how are you scoring them? And then who's making this decision? Who's in the room? Who has a seat at the table? And we think it's really important for all these programs to have a range of representatives, from safety to non-motorized, sometimes transit if appropriate. And then political support. We've been talking a lot about the rules. Well, those rules get written by people, and those people report to somebody. And so building that political support, making sure that we have champions in the political system is really critical, and that's also a role of advocates, but it's something that that everyone can sort of keep in mind as we set up these rules. Now, many of you say, okay, great, I'm not setting up the rules. I'm going to be competing for these funds. What do I need to do? So the first thing is the planning piece, and we talked about why that's so critical. If your projects aren't in the plans at the beginning, they're not likely to get funded at the end. And then I laid out some of the federal rules, but every state and region has to come up with their own set of guidance, their own application, and their own policies. So make sure you know what those rules are. Particularly make sure you know the schedule. When are these things happening? If you miss the application deadline, that could be a year, 2, sometimes longer before you get another call for projects. Really get to know your program staff. These are the folks that know the rules backwards and forwards and can help you all the way along with the process. Pete and I were just in Wichita, and that was the thing we heard over and over and over again from the agency staff there that are just setting up these programs. Work with us, call us first, call us early and often. You know, it's always good to have an eye on safety. This is something that has broad support and is really critical. And to be able to support your project, whether it's for the Highway Safety Improvement Program or not, having that data, so how many people are we going to help move? How many businesses are we going to connect to? How many trips are we going to transfer from a congestion-producing trip to a non-congestion-producing trip? And one thing that many communities have found helpful is finding a way to develop that match. If you can do that, if you can say, look, we have the money already, that makes it much easier to fund that project. And also if you've done some of the work up front too. It shows that you're invested in the project. There's some risk there, but it'll help you expedite the process as you go along. So we have put together a series of infographics that kind of explain all this, talk about the role that different folks have, and hey Ken. So I encourage you to go to Advocacy Advance / resources and check out each of these sheets that kind of walk you through the process. A couple of slides just to sum up here, and then I'll hand it over to Pete. The first is about performance measures, and this is sort of an overarching theme of MAP-21, where the federal government is really going to be asking, what is the impact of all these dollars that you've been spending, and what are you achieving the goals that you set out? So it's up to the states to set their own performance measures under some of the guidelines set out under MAP-21. So we're pushing really hard for non-motorized safety performance to be measured separately. We know that the number of bicycle and walking fatalities has gone up, and as vehicle miles traveled has gone down, the share of fatalities that are non-motorized has really gone up significantly. So we think this is a concern. We think if it's not measured independently, it may not get the attention that it deserves. So that's something we've been pushing for at the National Bike Summit, and we were able to get 69 members of Congress to urge, from both members of both parties, to urge Secretary LaHood to establish a separate safety measure for non-motorized. So it's a good bipartisan issue as well. I put congestion on the screen. There's a whole series of categories of performance, and really the point here is this is what we think. No matter how long MAP-21 lasts, it's my suspicion that this is going to be one of its legacies. So what do we do with all this? For one thing, we can make sure that we spend the existing Safe Routes to School funds that never expire. We can spend transportation enhancements funds until they expire after 3 years in which they were apportioned. And we just really need to set up these programs. And I talked about some of the best practices and some of the things people are already doing. Some of these programs aren't being set up yet, and we really need to fund them. That means not transfer them, staff them, give dedicated staff time to work on this stuff, and set up those processes so we can get some projects on the ground to show Congress that these are popular activity types, and we need to continue the program. And finally, maximize bicycling and walking investments across all the programs. That's where the game changer is going to be, and Pete's going to talk about how to integrate bicycling and walking planning into every transportation decision you make. But taking full use of surface transportation program, congestion mitigation, air quality improvement program, highway safety improvement program, and 402, that's really going to change our communities. And so I think everyone on the call, hopefully, is interested in that. So those are some of the three bullets, and I would add performance measures in there as a priority as well. So That's my presentation, and with that, I will turn it over to Pete, and we'll take questions at the end.
All right, thank you, Darren. Let's get Pete on here.
Okay. Can you see my? Show my screen. You see my screen?
We do.
We do.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, Darren. So what we're going to do is shift gears here just a little bit. Darren did a great job of talking about the different pots of money in MAP-21. That's part of the story of getting funding. But there's also another part, or half I like to think of it as, is really going beyond that and looking at all the other things that you can do to raise funds. I like this first point here, is that the perception of a lack of funding is one of the biggest barriers to keeping communities from investing in bicycle and pedestrian programs. One of the myths out there is that communities with a lot of money are the ones that are going to afford to do bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. I think I've worked in about 320 different communities now across the United States. Shows how old I am. But anyways, the one thing that I've discovered, which is really interesting, is that there's almost no relationship between the wealth of a community and the status, if you will, or the value of the bicycling and walking. There's a lot of both wealthy and poor communities that are really terrible places to bike and walk, and they're both wealthy and poor communities that are great places to bike and walk. So it really, at some level, has a lot to do with political will. It has a lot to do with how you allocate your resources. So there's a lot of different places you can get funding, and I'm just going to run through about 14 of them here, and there could be more, but that's about what time I have here, so I'll do that. I'm just going to start out with a little story. Many years ago, when I had my first job out of graduate school, I went and was working and was asked to do a bike map and asked to work on a trail project. Worthy causes, good things, but it soon became clear to me that I was sort of being pushed out of sight, out of mind. This would keep me busy, good things to do, but it wasn't really going to fundamentally change the entire urban area and make the whole thing good for bicycling and walking. So this was sort of in the early days of some of the stuff we were doing, and really got together with a lot of my colleagues at the time and talked about, how can we have a bigger impact? And we came up with a notion of institutionalization. So I just want to make it clear that some of the things I'm presenting here represent ideas from a number of folks around the country. So we came up with the idea that bicycling and walking really need to be part of an agency's mission, its corporate culture. We don't want special bicycle projects, special pedestrian projects. What we really want is everything a transportation agency does needs to do something for bicycling and walking. So that it's just automatically there in all plans, policies, and projects. So I'm going to go through 14 different ways, and there could be less, there could be more, but what I'm really trying to do here is to just convey a way of thinking about funding and about how everything we do is related to funding. So sort of three different areas I'll talk about modifying planning and design documents, finding sustainable funding, and building communication and collaboration. So I'm just going to go through these. Again, there could be more or less, but it's a way of starting to have the conversation and really about your thinking in terms of everything you do should be ultimately with getting more resources for bicycling and walking. So the first one, modifying planning and design documents and regulations. That's the overall title. And then policy and planning documents. Every community at some point is either creating a new policy or planning document, or they're revising an existing one. And so one of the things that I always suggest communities do is look at what you're writing right now, what documents are you working on, And those are the ones that you want to integrate bicycling and walking into those documents. So it's great to have a bike plan, it's great to have a pedestrian plan, but you also need to get them into every other plan. And so I even suggest that communities go so far as to make sure the word bicycling and walking on average get in every other page throughout a document. Because a lot of times good things for bicycling and walking don't happen because people just don't think about them. It isn't like they're anti-bicycle or anti-walking, but people just sort of forget to think about them quite often. And so this is a way of institutionalizing bicycling and walking into every single document that guides a transportation agency. And it could be also a park department. It could be open space plan. It could be any number of plans. Okay, a second one is the design guidelines and standards. Every transportation agency has design guidelines and standards that they use, and quite often they include, specific specifications regarding street width, sidewalk design, bike lanes, you name it, crossing facilities. And a lot of facilities are just designed cookie cutter. In the design guidelines, they automatically get built a certain way. And I'm always amazed at how much design is done with no visit to the site. And so if you can get the design guidelines and standards correct, you automatically get the right outcomes. So this is one of the most important things you can do in a community to make sure that you get the outcomes that you want. And so anytime there's an opportunity to be involved in revising standard specifications, design guidelines, standards, that's something you want to do. It's probably the single best way to raise funds, just about anything that can be done. Number 3, modifying planning and design documents and regulation. This is similar to the other one, but this is more specifically looking at zoning codes and land use regulations. They all require, not all, but most require some improvements in terms of street improvements, sidewalks, and you just want to make sure that whatever required is done correctly. So if you're building a new street, you want to look at the street width. A lot of times, for example, residential streets are overbuilt, too wide. Or if you're looking at intersections, many times you'll find residential streets with really forgiving curb returns, and then you wonder why people go too fast. So it's really looking at the codes again and the land use regulations and making sure that what you get is producing the kinds of outcomes that create a great walking and bicycling environment. Number 4, and I mentioned maintenance here because one of the things that's happening nationally is our freeway system and our bridge system is aging, and it's not uncommon, and you see the example here, is for state DOTs and county and even city transportation agencies, the percentage of money that's going to fix bridges is going up and up, and it's quite often topping 50%. So one of the bits of advice I always give to those who are interested in promoting biking and walking is follow the money. The money is going to the bridges because we're getting more and more bridges on our critical list, and be at the table. Make sure that when bridges are either rehabilitated or rebuilt, that they really do a good job of accommodating bicycling and walking. And this is really an opportunity. And we know if you can't get across the bridges, then nothing else is connected. And especially for the bicycling, which tends to be a little longer trip, the bridges are absolutely critical. Sustainable funding. Switching topics here a little bit, as one is the needs prioritization. And Darren talked about this a little bit, but certainly one of the things that I always volunteer for, and it's a really important way to raise funds for bicycling and walking, is to be involved in needs prioritization and the funding criteria. So most agencies or cities or counties have some sort of a prioritized list, and they have criteria for doing that. So I always tell people, volunteer when the time comes to write the prioritization criteria, the funding criteria, so that good bicycle and pedestrian projects are competitive. In other words, it's one thing to have a prioritized list of bicycle and pedestrian projects, but is that a separate list? And that's okay, but you still want them to be competitive in the overall list. So if you have a capital program, like a 5 or 6 year capital projects program, or annual maintenance program, or just annual programs, you want to make sure that good bike and ped projects compete with the other modes for those funds. Number 6, and this is just another way of saying what we've been talking a little bit, but you've all heard the terms routine accommodation, complete streets, and obviously that's an excellent way to get a lot of bicycle and pedestrian projects funded through sort of piggybacking and being part of other projects. One of the movements we're seeing around the country is, along with routine accommodation and complete streets, we are noticing that people are tying this then to redoing their design guidelines or their design standards, which I had shown you earlier, is that is sort of a complete streets design manual is something that's more and more often being done, with the idea that we'll automatically, through complete streets, create a new design manual and then build our urban environments in a way that accommodates bicycle and walking. Number 7, this is just a nuts and bolts kind of practical one, having shovel ready. And if you remember Darren's slide where he showed sort of the peak in funding a couple of years ago with the stimulus package, and that was because there were so many bicycle and pedestrian projects that were ready to go. And one of the reasons, of course, that quite often there's funds available for shovel-ready projects is that some communities don't spend all their money, and they, for one reason or another, it gets turned back to the MPO or the state, and then it gets reallocated. And usually there's a timeline associated with it, and so having something shovel-ready is really a great way to get a lot of funds. Environmental impact statements, and 2 magic words here: mitigation, restoration. Restoration in particular is a great way to get a lot of funds for, especially for like sidewalk and trail projects. One of the things I always suggest that every community does is look where the new water lines are going to go, and look where the sewer lines are going to go. Look where there may be any fiber optics lines going, both in the public sector and the private sector. Anytime you're creating a linear corridor for anything, either above ground or below ground, it's an opportunity to get something built as part of restoration. And we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to tell any war stories here, but a lot of, when I worked with the city of Seattle, for example, a lot of the trails were paid for, at least in part, through restoration of putting in things like various water lines and fiber optic lines, that kind of thing. First cousin to EIS is health impact assessments. Darren touched on this a little while ago when he was talking about CMAQ funds. And again, as these become more popular, I think they will, it's really a wonderful way to use this process to get more additional improvements for bicycling and walking. Transit, I'm not going to get into details here, but FDA funding now is more available for quote-unquote alternative modes, and certainly when you're doing stationary planning and also getting to the stations, this is an opportunity to work closely with your transit agencies and look for ways to improve both getting to the station and storage at the station. For example, if you're biking, to really bring those 2 different modes together. Number 11, and I'm going to talk here real quickly about 3 different kinds of public involvement. I mentioned a few minutes ago that I'd been to about 230 different cities now over the years working, and it's always interesting to me to note that some communities create great plans, but none of them get implemented, and other communities, everything they plan gets implemented. I'm always looking for what's the common denominator of success. Why do some communities succeed and some don't? And the only common denominator I've been able to figure out over time is the ones that figure out how to do the public process. And public process can be one of the most challenging things you'll ever do, but if you don't do it and figure out how to do it, in the long run, you're not going to fundamentally change your community to create a great environment for biking and walking. So I always like to think of public involvement involved in 3 different ways. One is a bicycle pedestrian advisory board, and then in a minute I'll talk about 2 other ways. But first of all, having a bicycle and or pedestrian advisory board is a way of creating ongoing input, and really you need to set up a system where they're providing input on everything your local transportation agency does. And I do a whole half-day seminar just on this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we can certainly take a question on it later or talk offline if people are interested in this. But it needs to be official. In other words, it needs to be created by resolution or ordinance, because what bike and pedestrian advisory boards do is they provide program continuity that transcends the election cycle or the cycle of a particular department head. It may take 5 or 10 years to fundamentally change a community, and that means that you're going to go through 2 or 3 mayors in that time, typically, not always. You're going to go through department heads, division directors. There's going to be a lot of change, and they're not going to all have that same commitment to bicycling and walking, and yet you need that institutional continuity. So creating an official board is a great way of creating that continuity over time to make sure that you really can change your community. Number 12. This is part of that 3-legged stool that I'm going to mention here in terms of public involvement. Is in addition to having a bike and ped advisory board, you need advocacy groups, and they really can do a lot of things that a more formalized board won't do. By the way, one thing I forgot to mention on a bike or ped board is that it needs to look like the community. So in terms of diversity, geographic diversity, and the more it looks like the community, the more legitimate it will be perceived by decision makers. So going back to number 12, advocacy groups, you'll see the number is 25,222 here. And this is just to make a point. There are 52 weeks in the year, and you take 2 off of the holidays, so that leaves 50. And you divide it by 2, you get 25. And what I'm suggesting is that with just 25 people, you can fundamentally change your community. What I see in a lot of communities is there'll be 1 or 2, 3 advocates, and these same advocates show up at every public hearing, write all the letters, do all the work, and they're saints, they're great people, but at some point, people quit listening to them, and you already know what they're going to say, and they get dismissed, and so really a lot of this good work, I think, is not heard. And also there's a perception there's just 1 or 2 or 3 people feel this way, so as a decision maker, why do you need to listen to that person? So one of the things that I always suggest advocates do is put together an advocacy group, just get 25 people who all commit to going to 2 meetings a year, to writing 2 letters a year, to sending 2 emails a year, to meeting with 2 elected officials a year. So it's really not a very big commitment in terms of what a volunteer could be expected to do. But by really having a diverse group, 25 people, and really being purposeful about the amount of contacts you have, what you do, who you contact, you can really create a sense that there's a lot of people. And in fact, usually there are, but this is just an example of to suggest that you need to be very thoughtful, purposeful about your advocacy, and it really doesn't take that many people. Then a third one is the geographically based groups, and that's a neighborhood group. And in other words, to join these groups, you have to live or have a business in this particular area. Just a quick little story here is back in the 90s when I was working with the city of Seattle, there were 36 neighborhood plans that were created. I think 2 of them were in industrial areas, but the remaining plans, the other 34, every single one of them had raised issues about pedestrian safety. So when the neighborhood groups were, I think they were all given like $5,000 or $6,000, that emerged as the #1 common denominator in all the plans. And I think about 30 of them identified pedestrian issues in the neighborhood. So really fascinating, and even more fascinating was what was not in the plan. Not a single one of the neighborhood plans said things like, we want to improve the level of service, in a street in our neighborhood, or please widen our street, or this or that. And so what it showed was that there was a disconnect between what our agency thought should be their mission and what people really wanted. And this really gets back to funding, because as we all know, there's tremendous shortages of funding in transportation, and we're continually having to go to the voters to ask them for more funding. And I think some of the dynamic going on is to look at more state, regional, local funding schemes, things that people vote on. And if people are going to say, yes, raise my taxes, I'm willing to pay more, we in the transportation professional realm have to do a better job of listening. And so that's really the point of this particular slide, is that funding is tied to listening and to producing the kinds of transportation systems that people want. And then finally, recognition for good work. One of the things that I think advocacy groups and people interested in bicycling and walking can often do a much better job of is really recognizing and thanking those who do good work, and really building on the idea of collaboration and civility. The 3-to-1 rule, it's a rule I always tell advocacy groups, is that you have to give 3 compliments for every whine. So thank you for doing this right, thank you for doing this right, thank you for doing this right, and then you could do better here. But sort of earn your complaints. Don't just complain. Everyone's human. They like to be acknowledged for the good work they do, and whether you're in government, private not-for-profits, consulting, advocacy, it really works that way. So I think that's a really good foundation to build on. And it's always good to recognize people at public meetings, to recognize people at annual awards, banquets, and really build that cooperation and collaboration. So with that, I'm going to end. And James, I'll turn it back to you, and I guess we'll do questions.
All right, thanks, Pete. At this point, we have some time for questions. If you haven't already done so, please enter your questions into the question box. And so the first question I have is, do you know any ways that transit agencies can leverage funding sources to improve bike and ped access to transit?
This is Darren. I'll start. There's a few things. I'll tell you, we were just down in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and one of the planners down there was really excited about flexing some of their service transportation dollars. I don't remember if it was STP or TA to transit because some of the requirements were a little different. Some of the matches were a little different. So the city of Atlanta wanted to do that, to have a lower match threshold for some of the transit programs. So on our website, both on the bikeleague.org website / reports and advocacyadvance.org / resources, we have a document that we call Find It, Fund It, and it mentions a lot of different funding programs that can fund bicycling and walking. I think transit's on there. The other piece is the Federal Highway Administration recently changed the catchment area and broadened the catchment area for what's considered proximate to a transit station. So now I think it's like quarter mile, half mile for walking, and 2 to 5 miles. I'm sorry, I'm estimating. I can't remember. But they broadened the catchment area, the parameters that's considered connecting biking and walking facilities to transit. So it gives transit agencies more opportunities to say, yes, this is a trail, or this is a sidewalk, or this is a bike lane that is going to help people access our facility. Now, it doesn't provide more dollars to do that. It just means they can use those dollars in a more flexible way than they could before.
Okay. Do you know if the restoration of historic transportation structures, such as canals, are eligible under TAP?
Yeah, let me, so some of the historic preservation is still available, and some has been restricted a little bit, so I'm just going to look that up real quick. If you want to do the next question, I'll come back to that one.
Sure. Do you know if authorized MAP-21 funds have been reduced under the recent sequestration?
Yes, good question. This may be another one to give you a really precise answer. I'll have to get back to you. I can tell you that Tiger seems to have survived that, which is good. So if you're not familiar with Tiger, it's a discretionary program from the FHWA from USDOT, and my understanding is because most of the funds come from the Highway Trust Fund, most of it's protected from sequestration. That might affect the portion that comes from the general funds, but I have to tell you, I haven't heard any alarm bells yet. So I think the idea is that these MAP-21 funds are going to be okay. I'd have to get back to you with a more informed answer, to be honest.
Okay. And I'm just seeing note from one of the attendees who's with FHWA saying that historic transportation facilities are eligible, and that would include canals, and that sequestration does not directly affect Federal Highway Trust Fund programs, but it's mostly protected. Only the NHPP has had a small decrease.
Okay, I feel redeemed.
So, thank you for contributing those answers. Do you know if in-kind matches would qualify for the 20% match under the new program?
So that depends still on the state. That's a state-level decision. So we're kind of seeing the trend going away from in-kind, but you have to check with your state to see what that level policy is. It's still allowed at the federal level.
Does HSP include funding for maintenance for non-motorized facilities?
It's construction funds, so no.
Okay. Do you have any recommendations for who small or rural communities should turn to if leveraging a transportation, or if lacking a transportation agency in their community, or how they should get involved with the planning process when it's sort of run by a concentrated, small, closed planning department?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think the first thing, it sounds like the questioner has some experience with the folks involved, but I think you got to reach out to the state officials for that district of the state and make those connections first. Try and understand the lay of the land, understand who is among that group and making those decisions, and then sometimes just asking. I mean, Pete's great. He always tells a story about some of these things, some of these committees no one wants to sit on, so just volunteer, and they're happy to let you. And so sometimes that can be the case here. Other times it's not so easy, and they're happy with the system the way it is. So at that point, that's when need to sort of figure out who they respond to and how to influence their decision to encourage them to allow you to participate more in a more open process. But most agencies are really quite good about it. They have public engagement opportunities. It's just a question of making sure that you're in touch with your, in this case, state level and state district level staff to know when those opportunities are.
Okay. Can a city partner with a nonprofit for HSIP funds to work to redesign interchanges?
Typically with HSIP, that's a fairly state-led process. So you would need to work through either the state agency or the applicant agency, depending on what the system is in that state. That's not one that I know of a lot of collaboration with a nonprofit. I'll tell you, in Virginia, there was an advocate working on a trail program. He was trying to figure out funding for it, and because of the policy that they had, VDOT actually came to them and said we should use safety funds for the intersection part of this trail. So, sometimes it's just it's about sort of having the right policies in place, but that's one where you really have to work with the state folks. Typically, sometimes they'll localize that, but usually it's a state level decision-making process. And again, sometimes it's really about asking. There's tend to be an emphasis on kind of booze and belts, seat belts and alcohol. And so sometimes, even though bicycling and walking safety might be included in the plans, the people day-to-day making these project decisions aren't necessarily thinking about them. So making sure that you're on their radar is the first step there.
Okay. You mentioned that state agencies are not eligible to compete for TA funds. Are they eligible to construct the projects that win? Otherwise, how can the state agency be assured that appropriate environmental and other processes are followed?
Yeah, no, great question. And so the state can and will typically administer the projects and cover all those bases. The key piece that got pushed down to the local level is that project selection piece, and even that will be done in coordination with the DOT. But just a little bit more, that decision-making authority, it rests with the MPOs now. But the state will typically still be the one to administer the project.
Okay. How do you recommend a bike advocacy organization begin discussions of creating a local bicycle and pedestrian advisory board?
Pete, you want to take a crack at this? And
Yeah. I think it's a few things. One is there's really good models out there, and there's really good legislation out there. So I would start doing some research. And then typically, I think the way I've seen it happen is, there's several ways that they're formed. One is it's done in conjunction with, say, a development of a bicycle or a pedestrian plan, where that becomes part of the implementation strategy. So you sort of piggyback it on. That's a good way to do it. I've seen other communities like do a one-day or half-day charrette, where they bring people together and go through a structured exercise or conversation about how to do it and put it together. And then, of course, ultimately it takes political support. And so certainly bringing in decision makers, elected officials from the very, very beginning is going to be key.
And I'll just add that one of my colleagues, former colleagues at the League, put together an advocacy advance report on bicycle and pedestrian advisory committees. And so, again, I'll just direct you to bikeleague.org/reports or advocacyadvance/resources. And he did a pretty good job summarizing some of the ins and outs of that process.
Okay. Going back to HSIP, you had mentioned that all public streets are eligible. Does that include local streets or only federal aid eligible streets?
No, that includes local streets, and that's a really key distinction there. It's that risk and safety don't know who owns the streets, and so the program is really designed to find whatever corridor, intersection, or what have you is subject to risk, and it's eligible. So.
Do you by any chance know when the application process occurs? Is it annual or biannual? Or biennial, I should say?
So that's a really key question that varies by the answer to that varies by state. Typically they'll make project selections every year, typically, but when that happens is really up to them, and that's a program that STP tends to be very more transparent, I think, than HSIP, and so it's really worth picking up the phone and finding out who the safety officials are, and ask some of those really good questions about when it's happening and what the application looks like, if there is an application, and if not, who do you have to talk to get your project up on the list.
Okay. I got a couple questions about smaller MPOs, less than 200,000. What about, you mentioned that MPOs can't submit TAP applications because they are distributors of TAP money, but does that include the smaller ones who are under 200,000?
No, they can. No, they, I think, would qualify as local entities. If not, then they can work with a local applicant. But I apologize for not being able to give a firm answer to that right off the bat. Maybe that FHWA guy can do it. But I haven't heard of that being an issue, but it's a really good question. Let me look into it.
Okay, and FHWA just chimed in and said that the MPO itself cannot be an applicant, only the eligible entities may apply.
Okay, so even for the smaller communities. Okay, that's good to know. Thank you for that.
Is there any one program that's better for maintenance funding on lanes and cycle tracks, etc.?
Pete, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I guess the examples that were brought up there of like cycle tracks and lanes, I'm not sure I would call that maintenance. And certainly, I think, Darren, as you started out by saying, is that in some way or another, all the different pots of money are eligible for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, and depending on the situation, certainly the legislation allows these pots of money to be used for, cycle tracks and for bike lanes.
Would that include things like snow removal or cleaning and restriping, etc.?
Darren, you're going to have to take that one.
Okay.
Snow removal.
Yeah, typically that's something that is left to the municipality to pay for, and it's often something that is a challenge, and it goes back to having that match, but also having local dollars to pay for the maintenance. So typically that's a local responsibility. There may be some variation at the state level about that, but typically these funds would be for construction.
Okay, routine maintenance is not eligible. Got it. Okay. Are states allowed to fund streetscaping projects under TA? Specifically, if the community wanted to include decorative lighting above a paved trail and vegetation improvements in a TA application?
Yes. Well, let me see here. Yeah, so streetscaping is mostly subtracted. I'm trying to find the exact language here, but again, that was that piece where it was, some of the more controversial pieces. I think you can do it as part of a transportation project, but you can't do an independent streetscape. So that's what I can tell you.
Okay. Do you know if a project is not selected by an MPO, can it be resubmitted for a statewide call?
Well, that also varies by the state. So we were just in Kansas, and they don't allow entities under, for example, the Wichita MPO to apply for state funds. But that is purely a state decision, and from the federal perspective, the expectation was that an entity could apply for both. And we've been other places where that is right built in. If you don't receive funds from the MPO, it will get automatically passed to the state process, so you get 2 bites at the apple. So it really depends on your state.
Okay. Is it correct that a state agency like state parks are not eligible to apply for projects to construct trails and bike ped projects in or adjoining their parks?
They should qualify under the public land agency eligible recipient.
Okay.
So they should be eligible. Unless if everyone wants to contradict that. My understanding is that they were intended to be part of the public land agency.
Okay. Do any of the programs have funds for feasibility studies and or land acquisition for trails, or specifically not fund those components?
So this is one where some of the more flexible programs like STP can be used for some of those planning activities. And again, that's something that can be restricted to the state. And again, not to pick on Kansas, but that was another one that we discovered recently. They specifically didn't allow that, but that's not something from the federal level. So that's another one I have to direct you to your state DOT to find out that policy.
Okay.
These are good. These are really good questions, and it sort of highlights. These are all the right questions to be asking, right? So what is the policy at my what's the policy where I am, and it really can vary. But the MAP-21 allows a lot of flexibility in a lot of these things.
Okay. And are there any set-aside funds in the legislation for federally recognized tribes?
Not set aside, but tribal governments are eligible entities to apply.
Okay, and could you reiterate your point about the Federal Lands Access Program?
Yeah, so FLAP is a great program that's getting a lot of attention, and we're actually going to stay tuned because we're going to put out some resources on that. But it's a Federal Lands Access Program, and it provides opportunities for trails and other transportation infrastructure in federal lands and access to.
Okay, and my last question for today is, do you know if anyone is doing any research showing congestion reduction potential for Safe Routes to School programs?
I actually can't speak to Safe Routes specifically. I know there's lots of research talking about what huge proportions of congestion are caused by parents dropping their kids off to school, so that's a big issue. And that's been fairly well documented, and there's lots of work done through the CMAQ program on estimating congestion reduction based on bicycle facilities, based on sort of population density, employment in the area, the length of the trail, and things like that.
I would just add to that many communities, 1 out of every 5 trips is the journey to school trip, about the same as journey to work trip, 20%. It varies, of course, community to community. And we also know that some schools have a lot of kids biking and walking, and some have like none. And we also know that you can get significant shifts in the number of kids biking and walking to the appropriate facilities and programs. So I don't know about research per se in terms of a national survey, but we certainly have a lot of good examples of schools that achieve very good outcomes.
And I'll just add, before we close, in general, the Transportation Enhancements Clearinghouse is now converted into the National Transportation Alternatives Clearinghouse, NTAC. So if you go to the old enhancements.org, it'll redirect you to ta-clearinghouse.info, and they've done a really good job. I'll just put in a quick plug for them if you want to know about eligibility, it sounds like there's a lot of questions about that. I would urge you to go to enhancements.org. It'll redirect you to the TA clearinghouse.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for discussion today. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. Once again, a PDF copy of the presentation slides will be available later today at www.walkinginfos.org/webinars under the Livable Community Series. And the recording of today's webinar will be posted to that site as well as onto our YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/pedbikeinfo within a couple of weeks. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. Again, that was facebook.com/pedbike for updates on this webinar and future webinars. I want to remind you that a very brief survey will appear once the webinar is ended. Again, we greatly appreciate you taking a moment to complete it. I want to thank our speakers, Darren Fluchet and Peter Lagerway, and thank you to all of you for attending today's PBIC Local Communities webinar.